Demonstrations across Iran have crossed the two-week mark today, even as the country's leaders have escalated their crackdown on protesters with widespread internet blackouts and the death toll crossing 100. Joining us now is Nader Hashemi, Associate Professor of Middle East and Islamic Politics at Georgetown University. Professor, thanks for making time for us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Now, these started with shopkeepers essentially protesting against inflation, the Iranian currency falling to a historic low against the US dollar. But in the days since, it's obviously turned into something that's much wider, a much wider movement. How are you viewing the scale of these protests at this point, 2 weeks in?
Well, the scale, the depth, and the breadth are growing. You're correct to point out that the spark that ignited these protests were economic grievances related to the collapsing currency, rising inflation. But Iran has been on the verge of a societal explosion for a very long time. In fact, street protests have been a staple of Iranian politics going back at least 100 years. And more recently in 1999, in 2003, in 2009, in 2018, in 2019, and in 2022, we've seen nationwide street protests. So this recent outburst of popular anger toward the state of politics and the economy in Iran is really nothing new. It's a reflection of the deep crisis of legitimacy that the Islamic Republic faces on the eve of the 47th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution.
We heard about 13 days in. At first there was silence, but we did hear from the Supreme Leader saying the US is either instigating or inspiring these protests. And we know that the US President has threatened to intervene, though we haven't seen any of that yet, even as the death toll rises. Is this US show of support helping or hurting the protesters' cause at this stage?
I think it's fundamentally hurting the cause of the protests, because the narrative that the Iranian regime wants to present to its own society and to the world is that these are fundamentally foreign-inspired protests coming out of the United States and Israel, and they're not really about regime incompetence, corruption, and authoritarianism. So the more that Donald Trump or the Israeli Prime Minister or other international officials speak out and insert themselves into this story, it plays to the strengths of the regime, which wants to rally people around the flag, wants to invoke themes of Iranian sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I think fundamentally it's a net loss for the democratic aspirations for the people of Iran at this moment.
These developments are obviously also coinciding with the US's unexpected escalation in Venezuela, entering the country, arresting its leader. Do you see these events as being related? Because we know both administrations, they're friendly, correct?
Well, they're related in the following sense that, Donald Trump has delusions of grandeur. He wants to sort of flex his muscle. He wants to claim that he's a great statesman. He's been able to take out of operation a major American adversary in Latin America, Maduro. I think he would love to claim that he was responsible for taking down the Islamic Republic of Iran. The difference is that, Iran is a much tougher nut to crack for American foreign policy. In other words, I can't envision the United States sending in a commando team to kidnap the Iranian supreme leader in the way they did in Venezuela recently. The other sort of related theme that's interesting here is that in the context of Venezuela, Donald Trump completely sidelined the democratic opposition. It's pretty clear that when it comes to Venezuela, Donald Trump was primarily interested in the oil and in a resource extraction, and he's very happy to work with remnants of the Maduro regime, provided they accommodate American economic interests in Venezuela. So to the extent that that's U.S. policy, it raises fundamental questions about, American support for the protesters on the street in Iran. I suspect, given what we've seen in Venezuela, that Donald Trump would love to cut a deal with the current Iranian regime if perhaps the supreme leader could be removed and there could be access to American oil companies into Iran. That suggests that Donald Trump is not very interested in the question of democracy in Iran. He's very much interested in what I think really drives him, and that is his own personal ego, but also his own personal and family's business interests.
I appreciate you, making that point. The motivations are very different and perhaps not entirely altruistic when it comes to the U.S. president going into, countries with authoritarian regimes at this point. I want to ask you about the personal cost of these demonstrations. Even in the face of this brutal crackdown, we've seen the unrest sort of spread, grow. The images coming out of Iran are so dramatic: cars and buildings on fire. We know thousands have been detained, more than 100 killed. Phone lines are down, the internet is down. Surely that makes it more challenging as we go forward for these demonstrators to organize. How do you see this playing out, given what we saw in 2022 and 23?
Well, as your question alluded to, I see heavy repression, a lot of brutality, a lot of innocent people being killed in what is currently taking place, I believe, a killing spree by the Islamic Republic of Iran against street protesters. They've done this before. They have the capacity to do so. Just to cite one example, when the UN Special Commission of Inquiry looked into the 2022 crackdown in Iran, they described the Iranian regime's behavior as a crime against humanity, replete with extensive torture and sexual violence against political detainees. In those protests that happened in 2022, at least 600 people were killed. That's what we're, I think, looking at. I think right now in Iran, at least not 600, but I think we're probably going to get to that number fairly soon. So this is a regime that is, known for its brutality. Iran ranks #1 in the world after China for state sanctions executions. At least 1,200 people in 2025 were executed by the Islamic Republic. So this regime has a very horrific human rights track record, and that track record is about to get much worse in the coming days and weeks.
We've also seen those demonstrations extend overseas, including here in Canada and across the world. It is scary for people whose families are in Iran to deal with the internet blackout, the lack of information now coming out of there. What will it take to fix the economic issues? Because it comes back to the U.S. and its sanctions that are largely behind the state of Iran's economy at this point. Is that fair to say?
I think it is fair to say there's actually a really good journal article that was published recently in the European Journal of Political Economy that looked at the state of Iran's economic woes. And they made a very convincing argument that if you compare Iran's economic crisis to other countries that have been sanctioned, and if you sort of do the math, the critical factor that explains the collapse of the currency and rising inflation are external sanctions by the United States that have been not just comprehensive and punitive, but some of the most draconian economic sanctions ever envisioned in the history of international relations. So they're really hurting the Iranian economy, and they're largely responsible for the spark that ignited these protests. And the only way that these sanctions can be lifted is if there's some sort of diplomatic track. And that's nowhere on the horizon after the recent June war in Iran between the United States, Israel, and the Islamic Republic. That diplomatic path is effectively shut down. So that means there's going to be no economic relief and no economic sort of prospects for things getting better in Iran, given the state of U.S.-Iran relations, which are very fraught and looks like we could be headed to another military conflict. So yes, it is about these external sanctions. Regime corruption and incompetence has always been there, but the critical differing factor that explains the collapse of the economy are those U.S.-based sanctions.
There is a sense of unrest now in several corners of the world. As someone who's studied these events over the years and has deeper knowledge of them than maybe many of us do you have any specific or general concerns, areas that you are keeping your eye on?
Are you talking about internationally?
Yeah, and particularly in the Middle East, because, it seems to be in various pockets now. We saw U.S. strikes on Syria.
Yeah. Well, look, the actual social and political and economic conditions that produced this current uprising in Iran can be generalized across the region. There is a distorted Western view of the Middle East that, Dubai and Qatar and Saudi Arabia reflect the region. That's a distortion. Many people across the region are facing the same type of frustrations that the people of Iran are facing. A corrupt ruling elite, heavy political repression, no prospects for getting a job, no prospects for things getting better. Many of these regimes, such as, for example, the one in Egypt or in Morocco or in Jordan, are backed by the West. And you have, largely young populations that are living in very dire circumstances. So it's not an exaggeration to say that what happened in Iran, while it does have unique Iranian circumstances, could easily happen in other countries around the world because the social and political conditions that are at play here really can be generalized across the region. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see in the near future similar uprisings where people are protesting for their freedom, for a better future, and then the regimes that rule over them cracking down very brutally. But of course, the difference will be that many of those countries that I just listed, those regimes are pro-American regimes, pro-Western regimes, and they won't get the support from Western countries when people start to protest, because unfortunately, our foreign policy in the West is very much connected to preserving an authoritarian sort of landscape in the Middle East, because there's a perception that those regimes are stable, they do our bidding, etc. So don't be surprised if you see, protests in another part of the Middle East. The response from Western governments would be, I think, very lukewarm when people start protesting for their, freedom and for their for a better life.